You disappeared before the wedding, she whispered, eyes locked on his. I disappeared long before that, he replied, voice low. You're just the first person who noticed. Why come back? He hesitated, then said simply, because here, I finally felt real. At 3 a.m., she found him, collapsed on the motel floor, fever burning through him, wedding ring tossed in the sink. He said just 3 words, no hospital, please. She never asked who he was. Weeks later, the billionaire the world thought had vanished, walked back through her door. Not for money, not for power, but for the woman who gave him silence, soup, and a place to disappear. The rain hadn't let up all evening. It hammered against the motel windows in a relentless rhythm, a cold whisper threading through the trees that surrounded the Everpine Lodge, nestled deep in the Oregon woods. Most guests were asleep, or at least pretending to be, in their creaky rooms. But Clara Weston was still up, wiping down the dusty counter in the front office for the third time that night, trying to chase off a familiar restlessness she couldn't name. Clara had worked the night shift for over 2 years now. She liked the quiet. No small talk, no curious stares, just the hum of the vending machine and the occasional rustle of raccoons near the trash bins. Mr. Langley, the aging manager who wore the same coffee-stained cardigan every night, sat glued to his tiny black and white TV behind the counter. He barely noticed her anymore, which suited her fine. But when the sharp crack of shattering glass echoed from somewhere down the row of rooms, Clara froze. Did you hear that? She asked, turning toward Mr. Langley. He didn't even glance up. Room 6, paid cash. Guy checked in late, probably dropped a bottle. Not our problem. Clara hesitated. Something about the sound hadn't felt accidental. It had sounded desperate. Langley, she said quietly. What if someone's hurt? He sighed, finally looking up. This place survives because we don't stick our noses where they don't belong. But Clara was already reaching for the spare key. She pulled up her hood and stepped into the rain, her sneakers quickly soaked as she made her way along the slick walkway. A single bulb flickered above room 6, casting a nervous circle of light. She knocked once. Hello, sir? I work here. I just want to make sure you're okay. Silence. She knocked again, louder. I'm coming in. The door creaked open. The room smelled of sweat, damp fabric, and something metallic. The TV played on mute. Clothes were strewn across the floor. A duffel bag lay open, its contents spilled. And there, collapsed at the foot of the bed, was a man, young, pale, shirt clinging to his skin, burning with fever. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, heart thudding. She didn't know his name, not yet, but something in her told her this moment would change everything. Clara moved on instinct. She dragged a chair from the corner of the room and knelt beside the stranger, her hands steady even though her heart was racing. His skin was flushed, damp with sweat, and burning to the touch. His breathing was labored, wet and shallow, like his lungs were filling with something they shouldn't. She didn't need a medical degree to know he was dangerously ill. Hey, she said gently, brushing back a strand of hair plastered to his forehead. Can you hear me? A groan answered her, low and raw, his lips parted, barely moving. No, hospital, please. 3 words. That was all he gave her. Clara hesitated. Her gut told her this wasn't some junkie or reckless drifter. There was pain in him, not just the fever, but a kind that went deeper, something fractured beneath the surface. She knew that kind of silence, the kind that came after a life-shattering loss, or maybe escape. All right, she whispered, no hospital. She couldn't leave him like this, so she made a decision she didn't fully understand yet. She stayed. She returned quickly with a washcloth, wet it with cold water, and pressed it to his forehead. Then she retrieved a kettle from the front office and a dented can of chicken noodle soup from the staff cupboard. The motel's first aid kit was pathetic, some aspirin and a few bandages, but she found a thermometer and some antiseptic wipes, just in case. While the soup simmered on a portable burner, she sat by his side, wiping his face, adjusting the blankets she'd stolen from the laundry room. She tried to lift his head and coax him to drink, but he was too far gone for much. Still, she managed a few spoonfuls of broth. He swallowed slowly, eyes fluttering, but never fully opening. Just a little, Clara murmured, her voice low, almost maternal. It'll help. The next morning, she left a folded note on the bedside table. A simple message written on a piece of craft paper she always kept tucked in her bag. You're not alone. She didn't know why she wrote it. Maybe for him. Maybe for herself. Over the next 2 days, she kept returning. Always quietly, leaving clean towels, wiping down the counters, bringing tea with honey and soup that she heated in the office microwave. She never asked questions, never pried. She didn't need his name, his story, or the reason why someone like him, well-dressed, clearly from another world, had landed in a rundown forest motel in the middle of nowhere. Because she knew what it meant to break quietly, to carry grief or shame like a second skin. She had once done the same thing, for weeks in a hospital waiting room, sitting beside her sister until the beeping stopped. So Clara gave him what she had never been given, not questions, not judgment, but presence and silence. By the third morning, the rain had softened into a persistent mist. The motel grounds were soaked, but quieter. The kind of quiet that settles in after a storm, as if the forest was holding its breath. Clara knocked gently on the door of room 6, holding a clean shirt she'd ironed and a thermos of ginger tea. There was a pause before a voice answered, rasping and low. Come in. He was sitting up this time, propped against the headboard, the blanket pulled up to his waist. His color had returned slightly, though his eyes were still sunken and his hair clung to his forehead. But he was awake, alert, watching her with something like awareness and caution. You're the one who brought the soup, he said, voice hoarse. Clara gave a small nod, setting the thermos on the table beside him. And the aspirin, and the clean towels. You don't remember much, do you? Not really, just that you didn't call anyone. I didn't. A long silence followed. He looked at her as if trying to determine whether she was safe, whether her kindness had conditions. Then he said quietly, Miles. Clara tilted her head. Is that your real name, or the one you want me to use? A breath escaped him, half a laugh, half a sigh. It's real, for what it's worth. She didn't ask more. Instead, she pulled the curtains open just slightly to let in the gray morning light. The pine trees beyond the window dripped with fog. You've been here 3 days, she said calmly. That's long enough to have a name. Miles looked down at his lap. He shifted, then reached into the drawer beside the bed. He pulled out a torn boarding pass, crumpled, its ink smudged. Newark to Portland. The name on it was nearly illegible. I didn't mean to end up here, he said. No one ever does, Clara murmured. His hand moved again, this time pulling a small cloth from beneath the pillow. Inside it was a wedding band, simple, gold and cold. Clara saw it, but said nothing. He stared at the ring for a long time before placing it gently on the nightstand. The wedding was supposed to be next week. She didn't move, didn't speak. He continued, voice flat. It wasn't love, it was business. Her family owns half the East Coast shipping lanes. Mine owns the other half. The marriage was expected, years in the making, coordinated like a hostile takeover. Clara finally stepped closer and sat at the edge of the chair. So you ran. I didn't run, he said too quickly, then softer. Okay, maybe I did. There was a strange relief in his face after saying it aloud, as if the shame of it had weighed more than the act itself. You ever do something because it was easier than disappointing everyone? He asked. All the time, Clara replied. Miles looked at her, surprised. She gave a small smile. But storms come anyway, even if you pretend the sky's clear. He held her gaze for a long moment, as if those words pierced something he hadn't known was bleeding, and still she didn't ask for more. Not his company name, not the bride's. Not what he'd left behind in that other world built on suits and mergers and billion-dollar expectations. She just stood, walked to the nightstand, and gently folded the cloth over the ring. Rest, she said. You're safe here. And for the first time in days, Miles Thorne closed his eyes, not because he was sick, but because for the first time in years, he believed her. The fever broke on the 4th day. Miles woke to find sunlight peeking through the blinds, soft, filtered, and real. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, his body wasn't at war with itself. The tightness in his chest had loosened. His head no longer spun with heat. But it wasn't just the physical shift that startled him. It was the stillness. A kind of stillness he hadn't known existed. One that didn't demand anything of him. No calls to return, no decisions to make, no eyes watching to measure his worth. Just air, just breath, just quiet. Clara had come and gone throughout those days like a breeze through the pines, present but never intrusive. She left tea, warm bread wrapped in napkins, clean socks, and always a note in her looping handwriting on handmade paper. Never a question, never a demand. He found himself watching the door after she left, waiting for the soft click of the thermos on the nightstand, the hush of her footsteps. She never asked about his money, or his family, or why a man who looked like he belonged on the cover of a financial magazine was hiding out in room 6. And maybe that was what made her different. She saw him, not the name, not the net worth, but the human beneath the suit he'd left behind. That night, with trembling hands and a heart too full to ignore, Miles picked up one of her handmade pages. It was soft, imperfect, speckled with lavender fibers and pressed wildflowers. He uncapped the old pen she'd left with it and began to write. Clara, you didn't ask where I came from or why I looked like I didn't belong. You didn't try to fix me. You just let me be. And that saved me in a way I didn't know I needed. I came here to disappear, but instead I found stillness, and someone who gave without expecting anything in return. Thank you for the silence. Miles, he folded the letter carefully and set it on the desk beside the mug she'd brought him soup in. Then from his duffel, he took the cloth that had once held the wedding ring and slipped inside it something else. A small embroidered handkerchief Clara had left him on the second night, folded next to a bowl of stew. That, too, he couldn't leave behind without saying goodbye. At dawn, the forest was draped in mist, curling like smoke between the trees. Without a sound, Miles stepped out of room 6. No suitcase, no suit. Just a man moving quietly through a world that finally let him breathe. He didn't leave a goodbye, only the letter. And the echo of someone choosing peace, for the first time in years. 3 quiet weeks passed. Everpine Lodge returned to its usual rhythm, slow, damp, and almost forgotten by the world. The rain had tapered into a gentle drizzle most mornings, and the forest hummed with its usual symphony of birdsong, wind, and the occasional crunch of gravel as a pickup rolled through. Clara fell back into her routine, folding towels behind the front desk, refilling the coffee pot, checking thermostats and comforting travelers with extra blankets. Room 6 had been cleaned days ago, the sheets fresh, the window left cracked just enough to let in the scent of pine. She hadn't spoken Miles' name aloud, not once, not even to herself, until the bell above the door chimed. "Morning, Clara," came the familiar voice of Mr. Halston, a retired park ranger who stayed at the lodge every other Thursday while visiting his son in town. He dropped his duffel near the counter with a soft grunt, then pulled a folded newspaper from under his arm. "You seen the news yet?" he asked, flattening the front page with a dramatic sweep. Clara glanced up from her notes. "Not today. Something interesting?" "Oh, definitely." He tapped the headline with one calloused finger. "Billionaire heir disappears hours before high-profile wedding. Miles Thorne missing." The name sliced clean through the quiet of her mind. Her eyes fell on the grainy photo printed beneath the headline. A man in a tuxedo, perfectly styled hair, posture that screamed power and privilege. But his eyes. Clara would have known them anywhere. Not because of the headlines, not because of the spectacle, but because she had once knelt beside that man on the floor of room 6, pressing a cool cloth to his fevered skin. Because she had watched him stare at a simple bowl of soup like it was the first act of kindness he'd seen in years. Mr. Halston chuckled, oblivious to her stillness. "Big mess, huh? Groom vanishes, wedding canceled, press is going wild. Some say he's snapped, others think he's hiding out in Switzerland. Can you imagine?" Clara didn't answer. She simply nodded, then excused herself quietly and stepped into the small back office, newspaper in hand. She didn't sit. She stood there for a long time, the door half closed behind her, the paper trembling just slightly in her grip. No tears came, only breath. and one quiet sentence. I hope you find a sky wide enough to breathe in. Because while the world saw a runaway billionaire, she saw the man who whispered, I don't want to be who they expect. And for a few quiet days in the mist and pine, he wasn't. He was just Miles. It was nearly closing time. The lodge had been unusually still all evening. Clara had just locked the laundry room and was wiping down the front counter for the last time that night. Outside, the mist had returned, clinging to the trees like breath on glass. A single porch light buzzed against the damp, casting long shadows across the gravel drive. She liked nights like this. Quiet, thoughtful, the kind of stillness that settled beneath the skin. Until the doorbell chimed. Clara looked up, her hands stilling on the cloth. The chime was soft, but final, echoing in the room like a held breath released. A man stood just inside the doorway, not in a suit, not in polished shoes. He wore a dark sweater, jeans, and damp hair curling slightly from the moisture outside. But it wasn't the clothes that made Clara stop breathing. It was the eyes. The same storm gray eyes that had once pleaded softly from the motel floor. No hospital. Please. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with memory, but neither tried to name it. Finally, he stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. His voice was low but steady. I wasn't sure if I'd be welcome. Clara didn't move. She didn't smile, didn't run to him, but her silence wasn't rejection. It was recognition. Miles glanced at the floor, then looked back up, meeting her eyes again. I'm not running anymore, he said. Not from my family. Not from who I was supposed to be. Not from you. He paused, then added, softer this time. I want to stay, on purpose. Still, Clara didn't say a word. Instead, she stepped out from behind the counter. Her boots were quiet against the old wooden floor as she walked down the hallway. Miles followed. They reached room 6 together. She pulled the spare key from her pocket, turned it in the lock, and pushed the door open slowly. Warm air spilled out, carrying the scent of lavender, pine, and memory. She didn't turn to look at him, didn't ask him why he'd come back. She simply left the door open, then walked away, leaving him with a choice. He stood there, staring into the room he had once fallen apart in, now filled with soft light and something close to peace. And as the door creaked gently in the evening breeze, he stepped inside. Miles stayed, not just for a night or a week, but in the quiet way roots take hold, slow, steady, and unseen at first. Clara never asked how long he planned to be there. She simply handed him a cup of tea the next morning, pointed to the creaky back steps of the lodge, and said, "Those need fixing." He nodded and got to work. They fell into a rhythm that didn't require explanation. He sanded wood, patched windows, and replaced the cracked porch railing. Clara taught him how to press lavender into handmade paper, how to steep pine needles into tea that soothed the chest, and how to spot wild violets between the mossy stones. One afternoon, he found her in the old storage shed behind the lodge, sweeping cobwebs from the rafters. This place could be something, she said, barely looking up. He glanced around at the dust, the broken shelves, the slanted floor. Like what? He asked. A paper studio, handmade, like the notes I left you. Miles looked at her hands, ink-stained, gentle, sure. He smiled. Let's build it. And they did. Day by day, the shed transformed. Miles installed new beams. Clara cleaned out old drawers and filled them with flower petals, natural dyes, and recycled pulp. They worked with the door open, letting the forest air mingle with the scent of cedar and drying paper. He began reading again, books Clara lent him from her shelf behind the front desk. Fiction, poetry, nature essays. She found him one morning asleep beside a half-finished sheet, a paperback still open on his chest. Clara smiled more now, not the polite smile of a motel worker trained to please guests, but the kind that crept up naturally without needing permission. And Miles, he laughed again, not loudly, but freely, not the controlled kind saved for press conferences, but the kind that said, I belong here. Together they built something small, something strong, not a legacy measured in dollars but in moments, in shared silence, and in the pages they pressed with their own hands. Room 6 had once smelled of sweat, sickness, and brokenness. Now it smelled of lavender, old paper, and soup. The same walls stood. The same draft crept under the window when the wind blew from the east. The same bed where Miles had once collapsed in fever still sat in the corner. But everything had changed. Not the structure, the spirit. Room 6 was no longer a place of collapse. It had become a place of quiet rebirth. A candle glowed gently on the windowsill. The curtains swayed in rhythm with the pine trees beyond the glass. On the table, 2 bowls of lentil soup steamed in the amber light. A teapot sat between them, a wisp of jasmine rising from its spout. Miles sat in the chair nearest the window, hands curled around his cup. Across from him, Clara sipped her tea with both hands, her elbows resting on the worn wood of the table, fingers stained with ink and tiny specks of dried pigment. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, and a smudge of blue ran across her forearm like a river. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was earned. It had been built through mornings filled with mending, afternoons of pressing paper, and evenings spent beside each other, reading by lamplight. Tonight they spoke softly of foxes Clara had seen near the creek that morning, of a book Miles had devoured over the weekend, of her sister's favorite wildflower, of how the scent of pine changed with the seasons. Their voices never rose. The forest wouldn't have allowed it. And then, somewhere between soup and the last pour of tea, Miles looked at her, really looked at her, as if something long lodged in his chest had finally worked its way free. "I didn't just come back for peace," he said, voice low. "I came back because I found you." Clara blinked once, then smiled, not out of surprise, but out of understanding. The kind of smile that comes when someone names a truth you've already known. Her fingers brushed a curl from her face. Ink smudged along her knuckles. "You found yourself first," she replied. "I just left the door open." Outside, the trees whispered softly. The moon was climbing behind the clouds, casting faint silver against the fog-washed window. Inside, warmth glowed from the small lamp on the desk where her paper supplies waited. Petals, mesh screens, cotton pulp, and clothespins. Miles reached across the table. She didn't flinch. He took her hand in his. It was stained and calloused, but steady. Her thumb brushed the back of his knuckles, slow and gentle. They didn't speak again for a long time. Words would have only cluttered what was already clear. This wasn't a grand declaration. There were no fireworks, no music swelling in the background. Just soup, silence, the soft pulse of presence. But this was the kind of love that didn't need noise, the kind that could only grow in places like room 6. Eventually, Clara stood and walked to the small shelf by the window. She pulled down a folded piece of handmade paper, lavender fibers pressed through it, the edges uneven. She slid it across the table to him along with a fountain pen. He looked at her, amused. "Homework?" She smirked. "Only if you want to stay." He looked down at the paper, then at her. "I do." This time it wasn't just an answer. It was a decision. In a world obsessed with noise, achievement, and appearances, sometimes the most radical thing we can offer another person is quiet presence. This story wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It was about soup, silence, in a motel room that held space for someone to fall apart and begin again. Clara didn't need to know Miles's net worth, his last name, or his past. She just showed up with compassion, patience, and no conditions. And for a man raised in a world of power and pressure, that was the first time he'd ever truly felt free. Maybe that's what we're all looking for. Not a perfect place, but a person who sees us without expectation. In today's fast-paced digital world, how often do we really sit with someone and just be? How often do we create space for healing without trying to fix, explain, or judge? This story reminds us that kindness doesn't have to be loud to be life-changing. What about you? Have you ever had a moment where someone's quiet presence meant more than any advice could? Do you believe people can truly change when given the space to simply exist? We'd love to hear your reflections. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We rate every one of them. If this story warmed your heart, please consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribing to Warm Soul Stories, and sharing it with someone who believes in second chances. Until next time, stay kind, stay present, and remember, Sometimes peace lives in silence and stays when we choose it.